Happy New Year! I'm Sandra Gibbons, welcome to my channel, and for this video, the first video of the new year, I'm going to talk about my favorite books that I read in 2022, and there were a lot of them. So the first book that I read last year was a fantasy novel that was written a couple of decades ago. It is To Ride Hell's Chasm by Janny Wurts. I picked up this secondhand copy at a local bookshop here. It was such a find, really great condition. Some of the edges were a little bit yellow, so I just took some sandpaper and kind of whitened them just a little bit, kind of buffed out some of the yellow, and it kind of revitalizes them a little bit without hurting the book too much. So yeah, I don't know why I went off the side, but this was one of my favorite books of the year. So some quick context, as you could see from the title, To Ride Hell's Chasm, horses are a huge part of the story. They're really important to Princess Anja, one of the points of view that you get in reading this story, along with the commander of the captain of the garrison, Mikhail. He is an outsider. That was another thing that I thought was really groundbreaking about this fantasy, was you don't see a lot of main characters that are not white, and Mikhail is darker skinned, and he's such a great character, and I loved getting his point of view. It was such a heartbreaking story, a really epic tale. The horses are really important to the story. I was obsessed with horses growing up, so if you're not into lots of emotional attachment and just tragedy and just things around the horses, and then this probably is going to be a little bit too heavy on that for you, but it was such a sweeping, epic tale of a princess that has disappeared. No one knows where she has gone to, if she was abducted, if something happened to her. There's a big question, and it's a race against the clock to try and figure out what happened to her, because I believe she disappears during the banquet for her betrothal to the neighboring prince that has come to the kingdom to take her hand in marriage. So, really great story. I was swept away by Janny Wurts' prose. So beautiful, so poetic. There's a lot of romantic elements about how she tells a story, and it was so good. It made me cry. So that was my first read of 2022, and I highly recommend it. I'm just going to go ahead and call out my Sarah J. Maas book. This was the sequel to House of Earth and Blood, House of Sky and Breath, and I think it came out around Valentine's Day or something, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't remember, but the ending of this book was just so perfect. It tied so many things together that I'm not going to explain, because it would be a huge spoiler if you are not acquainted with her books at all. So if you know, you know. This was one of my favorite reads. I love how she writes characters. I love the romance element to it. She's just really talented, and there's a reason why she's so popular, even though people like to poo-poo all over her. I really enjoy her. Another book I enjoyed was Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin. Obviously, since the House of the Dragon spinoff came out this year, which was so amazing, by the way, I had to dive in and read this book. The interesting thing about this book is it's kind of a dense read. It reads like a historical text, so it's not the most sexy or exciting kind of book to read, but it is written from the perspective of an archmaester of Old Town, which, if you're a fan of the series, you watched the show, Old Town is where Alicent Hightower, the Hightowers, hail from, so it's kind of their town. So obviously anything written in this book from an archmaester of there is going to be a little bit biased. So it was interesting to read this and then to watch the show and see how some of the very vague gray areas were navigated between the book and the show, and it was just done so perfectly. So if you're a fan, read this. It's not going to take your enjoyment away. I don't feel like it's going to take your enjoyment away for spoilers and that kind of thing for what's going to take place in the television series. So highly recommend this read. My next read, so I work at a sexual assault nonprofit. So this book right here, it is a fantasy type of book that deals with heavy themes of sexual assault, specifically around girls of color. And sex trafficking and that sort of thing. So this book is written by a Filipino, I think she's like half Filipino, half white, Melissa Chadburn. I believe this was her debut novel, and it incorporates Filipino folklore and kind of these fantastical, I don't want to say monsters, but these creatures into how the story is told. This was a very dark read. It was a very difficult, challenging book to read because of the seriousness of the themes and the ugliness of the things that were explored in this book, but it covers a topic that doesn't get talked about a lot because sex trafficking and rape and sexual assault of these girls of color is a huge problem and it doesn't get talked about enough. So this is a great book, and it puts a really interesting spin on Filipino mythology into how the story is told. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but these are going to be predominantly adult fantasy books, but I did read some nonfiction because I really love reading memoirs of people, and some of it's going to be YA and some of it will be literary nonfiction, but it's predominantly adult fantasy, so there's a little bit of something for everyone. But anyway, this is Jewel's memoir, Never Broken. Songs are only half the story. I have loved Jewel since I was like a preteen, I feel like. Maybe I was a teenager. But she's such a talented artist. Being homeless, growing up in an Alaskan homestead, she writes with so much emotional intelligence and empathy, and just a lot of how she was able to cope with hardships growing up and navigating stardom and difficult relationship with her mother and her ex-husband and things like that. It's just such an inspiring read. She's one of my favorite artists to this day, just so grounded, and she really understands what life's about, just creating and being real and genuine, and you know, spreading your gift and being happy. And she does a lot with kids too. I think she works a lot with the nonprofit fighting like depression in kids and stuff like that, and using creativity as a channel. So just read this book. It's so good. She's such an interesting person, and her life story is just such a fascinating read. My next book I don't have a physical copy of yet, but I do plan on getting one. I read it for a local book club type of thing over here. It's called Where the Wind Leads by Vinh Chung. It is the story of a refugee Vietnamese family that came over a few decades ago and actually settled about 45 minutes from where I live in Northwest Arkansas. So the story follows their journey from South Vietnam to just the open seas when they were refugees, to landing in Fort Smith, Arkansas, of all places, and just kind of how their happily ever after played out. Such a great read. If you're a fan of fantasy, I strongly recommend reading this book. It reads like fantasy. There are pirates in it. There are things that happen at sea that are crazy. There's folklore in it. There's just a lot of, there's like family politics, and then coming to America and the time that it's set, there's a lot of racial prejudices and discrimination and that kind of thing. So it's such a great story. My next two books I also don't have physical copies of because they were library borrows, but Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This was a recommendation from Hannah over at our pod on Wednesdays We Read, and it was such a fun romance. This was the first romance in a while where I had absolutely no complaints about it. I love stories that are about writers or authors or people that work in that publishing space, and I just love it even more when it's two people that are in that space coming together, and just how creative they can be and what their struggles are. Such a cute, heartwarming story. So that one was a recommendation to me from Hannah. I loved it. It was one of my favorite reads of the year. So the next book that I do not have, that was also a library borrow, is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and this was recommended to me by Hannah's counterpart, Laura, from our pod. And this retelling was so good. I couldn't put the book down. I immediately went and watched Troy after reading the book, and it was so interesting looking at that movie and everything that played out there, and just how the details were changed and stuff in the book, and it was so good. I had no complaints. It was kind of this slow burn, and then the last part of it was super action-packed. So great book. My next favorite read is House of Hollow by Krystal Sutherland, and this is a YA fantasy of lore that I don't really see a lot of. I don't want to say what kind of creature lore it is because that would be a huge spoiler, but it's so good. This was recommended to me by my friend Tessa, so shout out Tessa. Such a great book. Fell in love with it. Found this on Book Outlet. It's the hardcover for a hugely discounted price and had to have it. Like, the writing is so lush and gothic and dark, and it's so twisty and bent that you're just, it's kind of on par with Verity by Colleen Hoover, like that kind of twisty stuff to it. But again, this is YA fantasy, but it's so good. The way the atmosphere is written, you feel like you're there. You feel like you're in this putrid place and you can smell these terrible things and everything is just kind of spine tingly and you don't know what's going on. And so, great book. It's about these three sisters that are each very beautiful and very strange in their own way. And then one of them disappears and they have to figure out what's happened to her. Great book. Highly recommend that one. This one was another surprise. The cover kind of reminded me of House of Hollow, but it's Belladonna by Adalyn Grace, which there's a sequel coming out this year called Foxglove. But this one was like if Agatha Christie wrote Bridgerton with some major like Wuthering Heights atmosphere going on. Just moody, broody, a lot of fog and pastures and woods and that kind of thing. It's basically a whodunit. This girl cannot die. She's the protagonist and she just kind of bounces around from family member to family member until she comes of age. And then she goes to live with her cousins and she's trying to figure out what's going on. She has this cousin who seems to be dying. A lot of tragic things are happening in this family. There's like a little bit of spice. And then the spicy scenes kind of fade out to black. So I'll say it's like a level 1 spicy, but loved it. The writing is intoxicating and so lush and so dark. The opening sentence of the prologue will get you. It started with the cry of a baby. Swaddled in a crimson gown, bold as blood, Signa Faro was the most striking 2-month-old at the party, and her mother intended to prove it. It's like such a great book. And then for my top 3 books, I had an absolute favorite of the year, but I will just kind of talk about the second and third place books in no real particular order because I love them. But Babel was an amazing book. This was a dense read, but there was so much important information here and footnotes that just prompted you to go research some of this stuff happening for yourself. I really loved the themes of racism and colonialism, you know, being half Asian. The Philippines is one of the most highly colonized, if not the most colonized place in all the world. And it's just, a lot of this really spoke to me, and it should speak to everyone. The friendships in here were so heart-wrenching. You adored all of the characters. Some things shocked you. It was kind of a slow burn until the end when all of this stuff goes down, but it was so good. It did make me cry. I didn't think it would, but the very last bit got me. But it was such a beautiful book, and I think I enjoyed this more than the Poppy War. I didn't like how the Poppy War was written. I thought there was something kind of young about the writing, and there were a lot of things that were kind of glossed over in Poppy War. And I thought Babel, it was almost like a completely different author wrote this. There was so much writing growth from the Poppy War trilogy to this. So I'll be looking forward to, you know, whatever Rebecca writes next. And then The Sword of Kaigen by Emma Wang was a surprise favorite for me too. It's a standalone self-published fantasy novel, adult fantasy, and it is tragic, but the magic system is amazing. The family that this book centers on, specifically the mom, the Saki, it's so intense and heartbreaking, and there's so much on the line. The risk is so high. It talks about government propaganda. If you were to compare this with like the Poppy War trilogy, it's very similar in that sense. Poppy War was like looking at it from the perspective of Chinese, like mainland Chinese people, with you know, Japanese and other exterior countries coming and invading and taking over their resources and their people and their culture and everything like that. This is kind of from the perspective like a very Japanese influenced society, with like the fear of a Chinese type of country invading their coast and that sort of thing. So great book, heartbreaking book. You get so attached to the mom and her sons, and as a mom to a little boy myself, that really hooked me. And I'm not going to give anything away, but like, amazing read. And then my favorite book of 2022, and because this is my first video of the new year, I had to dress for the occasion. Kind of cheesy, but whatever. My favorite book of last year was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This came out in July. This is not her first book, but this is the first book by Gabrielle Zevin that I have read. It is not a fantasy or science fiction, but fans of either would really enjoy this book, I feel like. Friendship is the main theme of this story. It's around specifically these three friends. Two of them, Sadie Green, she is a Jewish woman, and then there is Sam, and he is half Jewish and half Korean. And then there's a third in their party, Marks, who is half Japanese and half Korean. And so it follows them, Sadie and Sam specifically, from like childhood into college years, and then post-college, you know, into their adult years. And Sadie and Sam, they had a lot of experience being in and out of the hospital for various reasons when they were children, and that's how they met, and they bonded over video games. And so as adults, they end up developing video games together. So the nostalgia is real. I think if you love video games, if you grew up on things like whether it's Mario or Chrono Trigger or Sierra games, those old PC games with like King's Quest or Hero's Quest and that kind of thing, you're gonna get so much joy out of this book. It's really going to just take you back. My voice is starting to go out. I've been sick for like weeks, so my voice is very tender right now. Beautiful book. I had absolutely zero complaints about this book. It made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me frustrated. The friendship between these people, some of the love tension between some of the characters was realistic. It's just things that you would imagine would happen in real life, of people growing up around each other and then going away to college with each other and things like that. Things like jealousy, things, you know, Sadie being a woman in video game development, you know, women aren't respected and taken seriously and she's a programmer, she's a coder. So there's just a lot of that to dive into. It goes from East Coast to West Coast, and it talks about some really complicated things. None of these people had like super easy lives. They had very different kinds of struggles, and in the end just like sweeps you in, and it just doesn't let go. And it, like, I still think about this book weeks and weeks after reading it. And this is going to be a comfort read. And like, look at the cover, it's so pretty too. Who doesn't love a beautiful book? And I had to do the same with like rainbow tabbing of, you know, humorous parts and sad, heartbreaking parts and things that I love. So this is my absolute favorite read, and I think fantasy lovers will appreciate it and love it and adore it as much as I did. So I keep talking about this one everywhere, and I just want more people to love it so we can geek out about it together. In the comments below, definitely let me know what favorite books you had, if any of yours matched up with any of the ones on my list. I had a lot of 5-star reads last year. I just feel like the books that I read just really upped their game. They were just so good and completely in its own league compared to previous years. I just enjoyed so many of the books that I picked up last year, and I can't really complain about that. So definitely let me know if you spotted any of those books that interest you or that you loved as well, because I am curious to hear about it. And then I am going to... next time I'm going to post a video on the new releases in 2023 that I am most looking forward to, and I'm sure that list will be long too, and then I'll just go on blathering how I always do. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you next week. All right, bye!